Hi, my name's Alexa, and my video project is on Anadromous salmon as keystone species and as bioindicators. So to be anadromous, these are species that migrate to rivers from the sea for spawn. They do spend most of their lives in the ocean, however they move to fresh or estuarine waters for the purposes of spawning. And then these contrast other euryhaline species in that euryhaline movement between fresh and seawater is a lot more frequent, while anadromy is a more seasonal sort of movement. And then in looking at salmon as keystone species, we're going to be looking particularly at Chinook, coho, Atlantic, and Pacific salmon. They contribute to nutrients of terrestrial and aquatic organisms, all the way from primary producers to terrestrial vertebrates. They're also regulators of insect species, as salmon are the main insect predators of aquatic environments. And then a lot of the insect orders that they tend to consume are Plecopterans, Dipterans, and Trichopteran species. So in understanding salmon as a keystone species, it's important to look at the nutrient dynamics of salmon species. So a lot of the nutrients from salmon will make up a significant portion of the plants and animals in both aquatic and terrestrial habitats, which also associate with a healthy salmon population. And their life history is what allows for the steady flow of nutrients from the ocean to these confined freshwater systems. So another important aspect in understanding nutrient dynamics of salmon and their ecosystems is that when they migrate, they tend to allocate a lot of their energy into spawn, which then leads them to dying. And then all these deposits of the salmon carcass shows increase in primary productions with the nutrients that they release. And then they contribute mainly to increases in nitrogen and phosphorus compounds. And then they also provide nutrients in the brown food web, aka detritivores, which are those who feed on dead organic matter. So the cultural aspect of salmon as a keystone species is that they're strongly tied to many indigenous tribes. This is with regard to culture, religion, and food, and then some tribes even view them as sacred. They're also large economically for a lot of coastal communities, an essential part of a lot of groups' diets. And then salmon can also be viewed with respect to the intrinsic beauty in rivers and forests. So salmon as indicators of marine ecosystems, they're often used as indicators of change because they're widespread in these ecosystems, of course. They're highly valuable both culturally and economically, as we briefly explored. They're diverse in species, life histories, and genetic variation. They're highly sensitive to environmental change, and then they're often incorporated in long-term assessments. And then they are seen as utility for a highly cost-effective indication of functional integrity of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, as well as general biodiversity. So of course, in discussing how important salmon are, it's just as important to talk about how a lot of the species are declining and then just briefly talking about conservation efforts. So a lot of the causes for salmon decline is habitat loss and environmental degradation, overharvesting, and then changing waters with the warming climate. So I found that many believe that conservation efforts is quite insufficient. I found some papers discussing how despite the growing knowledge of salmon ecology, salmon management has failed to sustain place-based salmon populations. And then I found a particular researcher talking about how salmon management policies should be developed and continuously updated with the latest scientific knowledge about population dynamics, change in habitat, and then harvesting processes. So to briefly sum up salmon as a keystone species, due to their life history, they provide an important transportation of energy between oceans, estuaries, and freshwater ecosystems. This is through their strong food web linkages and then their carcasses that increase organic matter and productivity in their ecosystems. With regard to conservation efforts, there needs to be an emphasis placed on mitigating the causes as opposed to treating the symptoms of the declining populations. And then with regard to management practices, researchers have emphasized a need for place-based practices and focusing on the population levels and habitat performance. This can be with regard to genetic diversity, life history diversity, and spawning and egg escapements.